Hi everyone, I'm Cassandra, and today I'll be discussing perspective taking in virtual reality as it applies to gender bias in the paradigm of a simulated STEM interview. And so this comes from two bodies of literature, the underrepresentation of women in STEM and embodiment in virtual reality. So we know that gender bias in STEM is an ongoing issue, and current research shows that the largest disparities are in engineering and IT. So it's not only the underrepresentation of women in STEM, but also inequity in the gender pay gap, experiences of bias in the workplace, and attrition through education processes, entry points, and career advancement points among women in STEM. And when it comes to gender diverse individuals, there's not much work, but it is beginning to emerge, and this work shows that these individuals experience greater gender bias and discrimination in the STEM workplace. In particular, they're perceived as being unskilled and incapable. And so the issue is certainly multifaceted. A recent meta-analysis extracted 5 categories, each with several subcategories of potential contributors. However, experimental studies suggest that gender bias favoring men rather than explicitly disadvantaging women is an overarching factor. And in hiring studies that compare identical application materials such as CVs, reference letters, and job applications where gender is identified only by a person's name, men are chosen more often, consistently rated as more competent, and given more benefits. So building on this work, a 2018 study proposed a causal link between gender bias and women's disengagement with STEM, and these researchers did find support for that causal link. So while some researchers suggest we ignore this issue, it is still important that we don't. And so why are we doing the current study? What can we do about gender bias? You might be asking, aren't there measures already in place to take care of this in the workplace? But again, these policies focus little, if at all, on gender diversity. In particular, gender bias influences decision-making under conditions of uncertainty or ambiguity and during selection tasks, both of which are present during the interview process. So although early research suggests that virtual reality may be a good candidate for anonymizing interviews, this isn't really what we want to do because blinding someone's identity can also have undesired effects. In particular, it can be dehumanizing. And people shouldn't have to hide their identity in the workplace. So what we really want to do is modulate unconscious or implicit biases in the real world to improve gender equity. And we know that no hiring studies to date have experimentally assessed gender bias during the interview process. So this is what we're trying to do using a virtual reality approach. So embodiment studies have shown reductions in bias for age, race, and socioeconomic status. In particular, when experiments include simulations of ecologically valid behavioral or interpersonal tasks. So compared to traditional perspective taking, these studies show greater reduction in bias and greater increase in empathy and pro-social behavior. And this is thought to be due to a more direct and immersive perspective taking experience, which removes the subjectivity of traditional perspective taking exercises. And here we have the concept of embodiment in particular. In this case, we mean a perceptual illusion of ownership over a virtual body. But we know that little research has been done on embodiment for gender, and virtually zero research has been done on embodiment for gender diverse individuals. So there are existing studies which both have several limitations, but what they did find was a greater bias on an IAT for males embodied as female during a movement-based task for the first study, and then greater bias on an IAT for any participant following any type of embodiment within a virtual office. However, these studies have several limitations. First, that the first study just didn't assess female participants. Neither study used an appropriate behavioral task. And the second study had people simply standing in an office while watching other avatars walk in and out of the room. So while this is a method that some people use for embodiment studies, it doesn't really represent the real world bias that we're trying to get at. And finally, both rely on the IAT or the implicit associations test, which we know does not accurately translate to behavior. And finally, the second study also did no statistical analyses, even though they compared changes between experimental groups. However, we had a more recent study in 2021, earlier this year, where the researchers found reduced bias on the IAT for participants embodied as female after they experienced a negative workplace scenario. So again, this highlights to us that context is important. So essentially, the study is the initial proof of concept to find out whether we can successfully influence behavioral outcomes through gender-incongruent embodiment. The study focused on male and female participants with male and female avatar gender identities and is now in the process of being extended to future studies with gender-diverse avatar identities. So we had first-year students from Macquarie University volunteer to take part in the study. It was a 2x2 between subjects quasi-experimental design, quasi because we have male and female participants, and they were randomly assigned to be either congruent or incongruent embodied. Congruent meaning male embodied as male, incongruent meaning male embodied as female, and vice versa for the female participants. We ended up with a final sample of 4 groups with approximately equivalent sample size. And so what the participants did, they first came in and read a job description. So this primed them for a position in IT or programming. And the participant would answer 2 attention check questions to further enhance this prime. 3 key skills were outlined, and interview questions were designed to target these skills as well as teamwork. They then underwent some orientation procedures, including system familiarity, eye tracking, and a movement integration task. So the avatar appears in the waiting room after the eye tracking, and they do the movement task where they look straight ahead of them with their assigned avatar in the mirror, which moves along with them in synchrony. And so this is the experimenter view in virtual reality when they get into the main interview room. The instructions appear on the screen to guide the participant through step by step. The buttons at the bottom, the participant can't see those, but the experimenter uses these to control the flow of the experiment. So I would choose here the gender of the participant, the gender of their assigned avatar, and the randomization of which candidate they would see first. Participants then underwent a room exploration exercise. So they were instructed to look around the room for 30 seconds and specifically instructed to look to the left to see their avatar in the mirror. And pictured here are the male and female interviewers in which the participants were embodied throughout the study. They can also look 360 degrees around the room. They then did a practice question session where they always read the first and third questions in a set of 4 interview questions that we developed for this study. And they would alternate with the second interviewer during the actual interview, who would be seated to their right. And so they were asked to practice these by reading them out loud when they appeared on the tablet screen on the desk in front of them. The participants would then conduct the 2 interviewers, 1 male and 1 female candidate, which you can see here. Again, these were presented randomly, and they could look to the right to see the second virtual interviewer seated next to them, who was always represented as the opposing binary gender to the avatar that they had been assigned. Each interview was about 5 minutes long. The responses were scripted and programmed into the virtual environment, and they were also piloted for equivalency before conducting the study. After each interview, participants would answer 12 questions using the hand controllers, using the scale from 0 to 10, and these questions were regarding competence, likability, hireability, and empathy. They also completed the 13th question, the IOS, which is a pictorial representation of interpersonal closeness. All the data was then recorded into an output file, including eye tracking and head and wrist movement tracking. Outside of virtual reality, participants were given the chance to review the job description and then asked which candidate they would choose to hire. This was presented in a random order on a computer screen. They would then complete this embodiment questionnaire, which is adapted originally from the rubber hand illusion paradigm and includes key components of virtual immersion. And finally, they would give us their demographic information. At the end of the study, participants were debriefed because we told them at the start that they would be interacting with 3 other remotely located participants, either at Macquarie University or the University of Western Australia, and this was to enhance believability of the interaction. So now that you know what we've done in the study, I'll give you our hypotheses. So we thought that people embodied in an incongruent avatar, so that's male embodied as female and female embodied as male, would be more likely to choose the female candidate and rate the female candidate higher on the response measures. We also thought these effects would be more pronounced for male participants, but that participants would exhibit greater empathy and self-other overlap toward the candidate that was congruent with their assigned avatar, regardless of their own gender. We, however, had secondary hypotheses for female participants, such that females could be more likely to choose the male candidate and rate this candidate higher on the outcome measures if they come to identify more with their assigned avatar, which would be in the incongruent condition, the male avatar. And this is because we're not quite sure yet whether virtual embodiment simply acts to reduce bias on its own, or if it reduces bias via identification with the virtual persona. And we think it is more likely that it's this latter situation. Finally, we thought that the relationship between virtual immersion and candidate ratings would be mediated by empathy, but not self-other overlap. And so on to our results. We are finished collecting data for this study. We found in the logistic regression that we needed to have the interaction effect in the model because it acted as a suppressor, even though it was not statistically significant. We did find a main effect of gender, such that men were more likely to choose the female candidate than women overall. However, looking at the individual groups, we found that in the incongruent condition, women were 54% more likely to choose the male candidate compared to equally likely in the congruent condition. And men were 167% more likely to choose the female candidate in the incongruent condition compared to only 24% in the congruent condition. And this simple effect was also statistically significant. For our mixed ANOVA, we had candidate as within subject, so that was the male and female candidate, and then gender and embodiment as the between subjects effects. So this was a three-way mixed ANOVA. We also controlled here for some order effects that we found. So we found no effects for competence or higher ability. For likability, we found that women rated any candidate higher than men, so they rated them as more likable. And for self-other overlap, we found greater ratings for the female candidate in the incongruent condition and greater ratings for the male candidate in the congruent condition. But our most promising effect was a statistically significant three-way interaction for empathy. So we had, for male participants embodied as male, they rated the male candidate as higher on empathy, expressed more empathy toward the male candidate. But when they were embodied as female, they expressed more empathy toward the female candidate. And this is in the expected direction. And it's the same pattern for female participants. So when they're embodied as male in the incongruent condition, they express more empathy toward the male candidate. And finally, our mediation analyses. We have the predictor variable as immersion and the outcome variables as competence, hireability, and likability, mediated by empathy and self-other overlap. And we found for the male candidate that empathy but not self-other overlap mediates this relationship. But for the female candidate, we only found this outcome for likability. And this reflects some outcomes from our online study conducted last year, which shows that the female is rated as less competent consistently. And this is also consistent with previous research. And so with regard to our hypotheses, we found that most of them were partially supported. So what we're seeing here is a greater effect for men across several measures. And this does show promise for applying these virtual tasks among individuals with certain social privileges, which otherwise tend to go unchanged even with intervention attempts. And what we really hope to see in our future work is that this can be applied among cisgender individuals to enhance perspective taking regarding gender diversity. And for the hypotheses regarding the female participants, we found support for the latter part of the theory, that people come to identify with the virtual persona. And again, this supports the idea that outcomes are dependent on the context of the experiment and the tasks that were undertaken. And again, finally, we did find mediation, but there were stronger outcomes for the male candidate and for the female candidate. And so our take-home message is, firstly, we're extending previous work by showing that embodiment in virtual reality may work to reduce bias toward individuals of a marginalized gender identity via immersive perspective taking. Also consistent with existing theory, increases in empathy appear to underlie behavioral changes following virtual embodiment. So now future research really needs to understand whether these effects can continue in the long term and whether repeated exposures might enhance these outcomes. And this really needs to be done with gender diverse individuals, both in STEM and in other domains. Finally, future work should investigate ways to use these perspective-taking interventions in the real world, where they can be applied to improve diversity and inclusion within STEM organizations, and also within other organizations and communities where gender bias is an issue. Thank you for your attention.